The man never spoke about it publicly. Not once, not in interviews, not to journalists, not even to his closest students. That man was Bruce Lee. But 19 people were in that restaurant when it happened. 19 witnesses. And in 50 years, not one of their accounts ever contradicted another. Chicago, 1970. A Tuesday evening in late October, a small Italian restaurant on North Clark Street. Red checkered tablecloths, low lighting, quiet corner booth. The kitchen hummed behind closed doors. Someone's radio played faintly from the back. Normal sounds. Before everything changed, Bruce was eating alone. No entourage, no cameras, no students. Just a plate of pasta and a notebook full of training notes. He weighed 135 pounds that night, 5'7", wearing a dark jacket and glasses. To anyone walking in, he looked like a graduate student, not someone who would change a 270-pound man's life forever. Then the door opened. Gerald Kowalski walked in, 6'2", 270 pounds, a professional wrestler with 11 years on the circuit. 3 broken noses, none of them his own. His hands were the size of dinner plates. Gerald had a reputation, not just in the ring. What happened in the next 2 minutes, Gerald never spoke about publicly. Not for 30 years. When he finally did, nobody believed him. What Gerald didn't know was who was sitting in that corner booth. What Gerald didn't understand was that the quiet man with glasses had already clocked him the moment he walked through the door. What Gerald didn't realize was that this encounter would become the most humbling experience of his life. He spotted Bruce, walked over slowly, pulled out the chair across from him without asking. "Hey, you are that kung fu guy from TV." Bruce looked up from his notebook. This is what happened next. October 27th, 1970, 7:23 p.m. Bruce Lee was in Chicago for 3 days. A private seminar, invited students only, held at a small training hall on West Madison Street. The seminar had ended at 6 p.m. Bruce had 1 hour before his evening call with Linda. He wanted quiet. He wanted food. Dennis Cho, his Chicago contact, had recommended Piccolo's. Small place. Good pasta. Nobody bothers you. Dennis was wrong about that last part. Piccolo's restaurant, North Clark Street. Brick walls. Candle on every table. Smell of garlic and olive oil. The kitchen hummed quietly behind the counter. Someone clattering a pan. Steam rising from somewhere unseen. Ray Hoffman had owned it for 19 years. Dennis sat 2 tables away, close enough to watch, far enough to give Bruce space. He'd seen Bruce train for 3 years. He knew things about Bruce that most people didn't. And when Gerald Kowalski walked through that door, Dennis Cho recognized the situation immediately. He said nothing. Gerald had come from a local wrestling event nearby. He'd won his match in 6 minutes. He walked in with 2 associates, Tony Varga, 240 pounds, 8 years on the circuit, and a younger wrestler named Pete Dillon. They were loud when they entered, the kind of loud that fills a room without trying. Ray Hoffman looked up from the bar. His hand stopped on the glass he was drying. He recognized the type immediately. Nobody in that restaurant understood yet what was about to happen. Not Ray, not Tony, not Pete Dillon. The question was, which direction this would go. Gerald Kowalski was 34 years old, 6'2", 270 pounds, built like something that had been compressed under enormous pressure for a very long time. His left eyebrow carried a scar, thin, pale, diagonal. A folding chair. Pittsburgh, 1963. He'd finished the match anyway. His hands told the whole story. Knuckles broken and reset, so many times they no longer sat straight. Calluses thick as leather on every finger. Those hands had ended careers. Quietly, legally, inside the ropes. Gerald had been on the professional wrestling circuit for 11 years. 11 years of travel. 11 years of small venues and smaller paydays. 11 years of learning one truth repeatedly. He started in Milwaukee. 19 years old, 210 pounds. Walking into a gym that smelled of sweat and iron and old ambition. His trainer was a man named Hank Bellows, former military, former boxer. Zero patience for excuses. Hank looked at young Gerald for exactly 4 seconds. "You are big. That means nothing. Big men fall the hardest." Gerald didn't believe him. Not then. He spent his first 2 years getting thrown around by men smaller than him. Faster men. Smarter men. Men who used his size against him like a weapon he'd handed them. It took 3 years to understand what Hank meant. Size was a tool, not a guarantee. But then something shifted. Gerald grew into his body. He added technique to his size. He learned to use his weight deliberately, controlled, timed, precise, and he stopped losing. By 1967, he had a reputation on the Midwest circuit that made opponents uncomfortable before the match even started. Not because he was dirty, because he was inevitable. When Gerald got his hands on you, it was over. That was simply the truth of it. He believed one thing above everything else. In a real confrontation, size and strength decided outcomes. Speed and technique were theater. Impressive theater, but theater nonetheless. He'd spent 11 years proving this. Against big men, fast men, trained men, the result was always the same. He'd seen Bruce Lee on television, felt something he couldn't quite name. Not disrespect, more like disagreement. Here was this small man telling the world that size didn't matter. Gerald had spent 11 years learning otherwise. Tony Varga would say years later, "People think Bull walked over to start trouble. That's not it." He paused. Gerald had a question he'd been carrying for years. Bruce Lee on TV made him uncomfortable. Not angry. Uncomfortable. Like something didn't add up. Gerald wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for proof. One way or the other. He spotted Bruce in the corner booth. Recognized him immediately from television. Walked over slowly. His footsteps were heavy on the hardwood floor. Ray Hoffman watched from behind the bar. His hand still hadn't moved on that glass. The candle on Bruce's table flickered as Gerald passed. Gerald pulled out the chair across from Bruce. Sat down without asking. "Hey, you are that kung fu guy from TV." Bruce looked up from his notebook. He didn't tense. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply looked at Gerald the way a man looks at weather. Observing, categorizing, deciding. "That's me," Bruce said. Gerald leaned forward. His forearms came down on the table like two slabs of oak. "I got a question." "Ask it," Bruce said. Gerald glanced at Tony and Pete behind him. Then back to Bruce. "All that stuff on TV, fast hands, the kicks." He paused. "Real situation. Does it work? Against someone my size?" The restaurant had gotten quieter. Not silent, but quieter. Ray Hoffman hadn't moved. Dennis Cho put down his fork slowly. Bruce closed his notebook. "What do you think?" Bruce said. Gerald leaned back slightly. "Size wins every time. Real situation. I've seen it. I've done it. 11 years. You've never questioned that." "Why would I?" "It kept working." Bruce nodded once, like he was filing something away. "Show me your wrist," Bruce said. Gerald frowned. "What? Your wrist?" "Put it on the table." Gerald looked at Tony. Tony shrugged. Gerald placed his right wrist on the table, thick as a young tree branch. Veins visible under the skin. Bruce's hand moved. Not fast in a dramatic way. Fast in a waterway, like something flowing into a space already open. His fingers wrapped Gerald's wrist. Gerald couldn't move. He tried immediately. His face changed. The casual confidence replaced by something concentrated and confused. He pushed with his full arm strength. Nothing. It was like his wrist had been set into the table itself. "What?" Gerald started. "Angle," Bruce said quietly. "Not strength." Gerald pulled harder. His entire body engaged now. 270 pounds of trained muscle completely irrelevant. 270 pounds. Useless. The thought crossed Gerald's face before he could stop it. Dennis Cho watched from 2 tables away. He didn't stand up. He didn't react. He'd seen this before. He already knew how it ended. Bruce released the grip. Gerald pulled his wrist back, flexed his fingers, stared at his own hand. The room was very quiet. Then Gerald stood up, slowly, deliberately. "Okay," he said. "Stand up." Bruce stood. The size difference was almost absurd in the candlelight. Gerald nearly a foot taller, more than twice the weight. Pete Dillon stepped forward slightly. Ray Hoffman came out from behind the bar. "Hey now," Ray started. Bruce raised one hand toward Ray. Small gesture. Patient, calm. Ray stopped moving. This is where most people think they know what happened next. They're wrong. To Gerald, this was a test. To Bruce, this was a lesson. To Ray Hoffman, this was the most important thing he would ever witness. No camera captured what happened next, but 19 people saw it. And 50 years later, their accounts never changed. Gerald moved first. Both hands shot forward. targeting Bruce's collar and shoulder simultaneously. The grab he'd used successfully for 11 years, the one that ended things quickly. Bruce didn't step back. He stepped left, not far. 8 inches, maybe 10. Gerald's hands found nothing but air. His momentum carried him slightly forward. Just enough. Bruce's right hand came up under Gerald's left forearm. A redirection, not a block. The difference matters. Gerald adjusted immediately. He was experienced. He recovered fast. His right hand came down, trying to get position on Bruce's shoulder. The sound of Gerald's palm hitting empty space was flat and sharp, like a book dropped on a hard floor. Ray Hoffman flinched at the sound. Gerald's eyes changed, the question in them sharpening into something more urgent. He tried a third time, this time lower, going for Bruce's midsection. The kind of tackle that had taken down men twice Bruce's build. Bruce pivoted. His left foot planted. His right foot swept behind him in a quarter circle. Gerald's arms found Bruce's torso for exactly 1 second. Then Bruce's weight shifted. Hip dropping, center of gravity suddenly gone sideways. Gerald went with it. His balance broke at the ankle first, then the knee. He caught himself on one hand, palm hitting the hardwood floor with a crack that echoed off the brick walls. Dennis Cho stood up from his table. Tony Varga took 2 steps forward. Gerald was on one knee and one hand. Not down, but not in control either. He pushed himself upright fast. His breathing had changed. Heavier now. Chest working. To Tony Varga, standing 6 feet away, something felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Unfamiliar wrong. I'd seen Bull in hundreds of matches. Tony said years later. I knew what his face looked like when he was handling a situation. He paused. That wasn't the face he had. Gerald came again. This time he used his weight deliberately. The thing he trusted most. He got both arms around Bruce's upper body. A clinch, chest to chest. For one moment, he had him. 270 pounds pressing down on 135. Dennis Cho thought, for exactly 5 seconds, that it was over. Ray Hoffman's hand gripped the bar. Pete Dillon exhaled. Bruce was pressed back against the edge of the booth table. Nowhere to go. Gerald's weight pinning him. Arms locked. Gerald felt it. The certainty came back briefly. Got you, he thought. He hadn't. Bruce's left arm found the gap between Gerald's elbow and ribcage. A space the width of 2 fingers. He didn't need more than that. What happened next happened in less than 3 seconds. Bruce's hip rotated inward. His left arm expanded into that gap, not with force, with geometry. Gerald's locked grip suddenly had no anchor. His right knee hit the floor. The sound was a single heavy thud, like a sandbag dropped from a height. 270 pounds. Kneeling, Bruce stood completely still beside him, breathing normally, not a single step from where he'd started. The candle on the table hadn't even flickered. Everything you've heard so far? That was the setup. What happened in the next 2 minutes became legend. This is how it unfolded. You are strong, Bruce said. His voice was quiet, conversational, like he was noting the weather. Gerald said nothing. He was looking at the floor. Strength is one tool, Bruce said. Not the only one. Gerald stayed on one knee. Nobody in the room moved. Then Gerald Kowalski did something Tony Varga never forgot for the rest of his life. He nodded. Once, slowly, not defeated, not embarrassed. The nod of a man who has just encountered something true. Bruce extended his hand. Gerald took it. Stood up. 93 seconds. That's how long it lasted. The fight was over. Bruce sat back down, opened his notebook. Story done. Except it wasn't. Not even close. The silence in Piccolo's lasted about 4 seconds. Then Ray Hoffman exhaled, long and slow. Dennis Cho sat back down. Tony Varga and Pete Dillon stood exactly where they were. Neither had moved in 90 seconds. Gerald stood at the table. His right hand was at his side. He was looking at it, the hand that had controlled opponents for 11 years. The most important moment of the evening hadn't happened yet. It was still coming. 3 days away. Bruce looked up from his notebook. Sit down if you want, Bruce said. Gerald looked at Tony. Tony gave him nothing. Gerald sat down. For a long moment neither man spoke. Ray Hoffman appeared with 2 cups of coffee. Nobody had ordered them. He set them down quietly and went back to the bar. He would tell his son about this moment. Specifically this moment, the coffee, the silence, 17 times over 30 years. I didn't know what else to do, Ray would say. So I brought coffee. That's what you do. Gerald wrapped both hands around the cup. 11 years, he said finally. And he stopped. You never questioned the assumption, Bruce said. Gerald looked up. What assumption? That size decides. You didn't question it because it kept working. Gerald was quiet. It works, Bruce continued, until someone changes the rules you didn't know you were playing by. Gerald looked at his hands again. Those thick, scarred, powerful hands. So what do I do with this, he said. Bruce almost smiled. That's the right question, he said. Bruce wrote 3 lines in his notebook that night. Dennis never saw them. Nobody did. Dennis Cho paid his bill and waited outside. When Bruce came out 40 minutes later, Dennis didn't ask questions. Bruce got in the car, opened his notebook, wrote 3 lines, then closed it. Some things are written for one person only. 9:47 p.m. Gerald Kowalski sat alone in his hotel room on South Michigan Avenue. Small room, single lamp on the nightstand, window facing the street. His right wrist rested on his knee. He kept flexing it, not because it hurt, because he was trying to understand it. 270 pounds of trained muscle, stopped by something he couldn't name yet. He replayed the moment Bruce stepped left instead of back. Every instinct in Gerald's body, 11 years of instinct, said retreat when a big man grabs. Create space, use the distance. Bruce had eliminated the space, made it work for him instead. And in doing that, Gerald's size had become his own disadvantage. Gerald stared at the ceiling. Angle, he said out loud. To nobody. He'd heard that word 1,000 times in training. He'd never truly understood it until tonight. He picked up the phone, called Hank Bellows in Milwaukee. Late, Hank answered anyway. You remember what you told me, Gerald said. First week, big men fall the hardest. Hank was quiet a moment. I remember. I finally understood it tonight. Hank didn't ask how. He just said, good. Gerald hung up. Lay back on the bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. The specific thing keeping him awake, it wouldn't fully form until 3 days later. 3 days later, October 30th, the story had already moved through the Chicago wrestling community like smoke through a keyhole, quietly, everywhere, changing shape as it traveled. By the time it reached the third person, Gerald had apparently been thrown through a window. By the fourth, 6 wrestlers had been involved. By the fifth, Bruce Lee had spoken in riddles the entire time. Tony Varga spent 2 full days correcting people. Nobody got thrown anywhere. He grabbed his wrist, and Bull couldn't move. That's it. That's the whole story. People were somehow more unsettled by the simple version. Gerald made one phone call that mattered. He called Dennis Cho. I want to talk to him again, Gerald said. Not like that. Just talk. Dennis said he'd pass it on. 2 days later, Dennis called back. Saturday, 10 a.m., West Madison Training Hall. Gerald showed up alone. No Tony, no Pete. Bruce was already there, running forms in the empty hall. The space smelled of sawdust and old canvas. Morning light came through high windows in long diagonal lines. Gerald watched from the doorway. The movement was unlike anything he'd seen in wrestling or boxing. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. Everything connected to everything else. Come in, Bruce said without turning around. What happened in that Saturday morning session? Gerald never described in detail to anyone what was said between them. Only 2 people ever knew. Years later, Gerald would call it the most important conversation of his life, but he never repeated a single word of it. What he said afterward to Tony was 3 words. I was wrong. Tony didn't ask about what. He already knew. Most versions of this story end here. This one doesn't. What happened in the following weeks changed Gerald Kowalski permanently, and nobody saw it coming. 6 weeks later, December 9th, Gerald Kowalski changed one thing in his training, just one. He started asking why, not just drilling techniques, asking what principle lived underneath each one, what happened to balance, to momentum, to leverage, why something worked. Not just that it worked. His training partners noticed within a week. A younger wrestler named Carl Briggs, 22 years old, fast, technically gifted, came to Gerald after practice one evening. The gym was empty except for them, fluorescent lights humming, the smell of canvas and liniment. You are different, Carl said. Something changed. Gerald thought about how to answer that honestly. I met someone smarter than me, Gerald finally said. And instead of being angry, I got curious. Carl frowned. Who? Gerald smiled. Doesn't matter who. Matters what I learned. He'd been using strength to solve problems that angles could solve more efficiently. That was the specific thing. Simple, obvious in hindsight, invisible until someone showed him. He started winning differently, not with less effort. With better effort, his opponents felt it without being able to name it. Something had shifted in how he moved. In how he waited. Ray Hoffman saw Gerald one more time that winter. Gerald came into Piccolo's on a Thursday evening, sat at the corner booth, the same table. Ray brought coffee without being asked. "You came back," Ray said. "Needed to sit here," Gerald said. "Remind myself." Ray nodded slowly. He understood that completely. What Gerald never told Ray, what he never told anyone that winter, was the real thing he'd understood lying awake in that hotel room. It wasn't about technique. It wasn't about angles or leverage or momentum. It was simpler than that. Bruce Lee had been completely calm, not performing calm, not suppressing fear, actually calm, because he understood the situation entirely. And Gerald understood, for the first time, that real confidence wasn't about believing you'd win. It was about having no need to prove it. July 20th, 1973. Gerald was in a gym in Detroit when someone told him a younger wrestler came in with a newspaper. Didn't say anything, just held it out. Gerald read the headline. He sat down on the nearest bench, just sat. For a long time, the gym kept moving around him. Someone dropped weights in the far corner. A radio played faintly from the office. Normal sounds. Gerald heard none of them. Tony Varga called that evening. Neither man spoke for a long moment after hello. That Saturday morning, Gerald finally said, "In that training hall." "Yeah," Tony said. "I keep thinking about that." Gerald hung up. He went back to the gym the next morning, earlier than usual, before anyone else arrived. Ran his forms alone in the empty space. The movement felt different that morning, slower, more deliberate. It was the only way he knew how to say thank you. Years later, 1987, Gerald was 51 years old. He ran a small wrestling and fitness gym in Milwaukee. The walls had photographs, old circuit posters, training certificates from students. One corner of the wall had nothing on it, just a small handwritten note in a plain frame. 4 words. New students always noticed it eventually, always wondered what it meant. The answer only came once they'd trained long enough to understand it. Carl Briggs, now 37, a trainer himself, visited Gerald that year. They sat in Gerald's small office after the evening session. 2 cups of coffee on the desk, the gym quiet outside the door. Carl pointed at the framed note. "I've never asked you about that." Gerald looked at it for a moment. "Chicago, 1970, he said. "I walked into a restaurant thinking I understood how strength worked." He was quiet. "I walked out knowing I'd only ever seen one kind." Carl waited. "There's the strength that pushes," Gerald said. "And there's the strength that understands where the push is already going." He looked at Carl. "I spent 11 years learning the first kind." He picked up his coffee cup. One evening learning the second. Carl looked at the framed note on the wall. 4 words. Angle, not strength. Always. He never wrote anything else on that wall. He didn't need to. Gerald had written those words that night. October 27th, 1970. Sitting alone in his hotel room on South Michigan Avenue. He'd carried them for 17 years. He would carry them for the rest of his life. Dennis Cho, still living in Chicago, still recommending Piccolo's to visitors, said it best when someone asked him about that night, decades later. "People always want to know what Bruce did. What technique? What move exactly?" Dennis shook his head slowly. "That's the wrong question." He paused. "What Bruce did was show a man something he couldn't unsee. That's rarer than any technique. Most people can teach a technique. Almost nobody can change the way another person sees." Ray Hoffman closed Piccolo's in 1991. Before he did, he kept one thing, the corner booth. He put it in his living room. His son thought it was strange. Ray never explained it. Some things don't need explaining. 93 seconds. That's how long the encounter lasted. The lesson lasted the rest of Gerald Kowalski's life. And the ones he passed it on to, Carl Briggs and Carl's students after him, they're still carrying it now. Gerald said it best himself, late in life, to Carl over coffee. "I walked in that night with 11 years of certainty." He paused. "I walked out with something better." Another pause. A question worth asking. Strength is one tool. Understanding is another. The wisest men, the truly dangerous ones, know the difference.